"Is that really all your hard work was worth?" my grandfather asked as we stood alone outside the old county courthouse, and I smiled because for the first time in my life, I finally knew the answer. "Not even close," I replied. He studied my face for a long moment before the corners of his weathered mouth lifted into the same quiet smile I had seen since I was a little girl following him through his woodworking shop. Everyone else leaving the ceremony assumed he had been asking about the plaque I had just received from the Chamber of Commerce. It was polished walnut with a brass plate engraved with my name beneath the words Community Business Leadership Award. People shook my hand. Cameras flashed. Local reporters asked how it felt to finally receive recognition after more than 3 decades of building a family business from almost nothing. They believed the award represented the destination. My grandfather knew it was only a reminder of where the journey had begun. The autumn wind carried the scent of fallen oak leaves across the courthouse lawn, while neighbors gathered in small groups exchanging congratulations. Someone handed me a bouquet of white lilies. Another person joked that I should finally take a vacation after working so many years without slowing down. I thanked each of them with the same gracious smile they expected from Claire Bennett, the dependable woman who always volunteered for charity auctions, remembered birthdays, and somehow managed to keep her family together through every difficult season. If they had looked a little closer, they might have noticed something different about me that afternoon. The smile was real, but it was no longer carrying the weight it once did. My grandfather rested both hands on the top of his old hickory cane and quietly watched the crowd drift away. At 91 years old, Walter Bennett rarely wasted words. He had spent most of his life building custom furniture with his own hands, believing that careful work spoke louder than long speeches. As a child, I used to sit beside him in his workshop, fascinated by the way rough pieces of lumber slowly became dining tables that families would gather around for generations. He always told me that the strongest things in life were built patiently, one careful decision at a time. At the time, I thought he was talking about wood. Years later, I realized he had been talking about people. We slowly walked toward my car parked beneath a row of maple trees glowing brilliant shades of orange and crimson. Every few steps, someone stopped to congratulate me again. My grandfather politely nodded, thanked them, and continued walking without interrupting my conversations. When we finally reached the car, he placed one hand lightly on the roof before turning toward me again. "You know," he said, "most people think success is the thing everyone can see." I looked at him without answering. They never ask what it cost. His words settled into the quiet afternoon more heavily than any applause I had heard inside the courthouse. I unlocked the passenger door for him, helping him settle carefully into the seat before walking around to the driver's side. We drove in comfortable silence through the familiar streets of our small Ohio town. Children played football in neighborhood yards. American flags fluttered gently from front porches. Families loaded groceries into their cars outside the local supermarket. Everything looked peaceful, ordinary, predictable. Yet something inside me had changed forever, and I knew that before long everyone around me would understand why. My grandfather finally broke the silence as we approached the old farmhouse where he had lived for more than 60 years. "Do you remember what I told you after your first bakery failed?" I laughed softly. "You told me that failure only measures what stopped working. It never measures the person who keeps going." He nodded with quiet satisfaction. "And you listened." I parked beside the weathered red barn that had somehow survived every winter storm I could remember. Before opening the door, I looked across the fields where the late afternoon sunlight stretched over acres of harvested corn. That land had witnessed birthdays, funerals, family reunions, and more ordinary Tuesdays than anyone could ever count. It had also witnessed sacrifices that almost no one remembered anymore. As we walked toward the front porch, my grandfather paused beside the old wooden swing my grandmother loved before she passed away many years earlier. He rested his hand against the smooth railing and looked toward the horizon. "People will congratulate you for what they see today," he said quietly. "Very few of them will ever understand what you gave up to stand here." I swallowed the sudden tightness in my throat because he was the only person left alive who had watched every chapter of that story unfold. He had seen the nights when I worked until 2 in the morning balancing invoices by hand because hiring another employee was impossible. He had seen me sell my first new car to keep payroll on time during a difficult winter. He had seen birthdays celebrated with homemade decorations because every extra dollar belonged to the business that kept our family afloat. He never praised those sacrifices while they were happening. He simply noticed them. Standing beside him that afternoon, I realized something I had never fully understood before. The award inside my car recognized years of work. My grandfather's question recognized something far greater. He was not asking whether the business had been worth the effort. He was asking whether everything life had demanded from me had become something meaningful. Looking into his steady blue eyes, I already knew the answer, even though no one else did. The real reward had never been waiting inside a trophy, a newspaper headline, or a successful business. It had been quietly growing through every difficult choice I thought no one had noticed, and before this story was over, everyone who believed they understood my life was going to discover how wrong they had been. When people looked at my life, they usually saw the finished picture instead of the years it took to paint it. They saw the successful bakery on the corner of Main Street with fresh bread cooling behind the display windows every morning before sunrise. They saw newspaper articles hanging in simple black frames beside the front register. They saw customers greeting me by name and young employees thanking me for giving them their first jobs. They saw the community award sitting proudly in a glass case near the entrance. From the outside, it looked as though everything had always fallen neatly into place. Success has a strange way of hiding the price that came before it. Very few people ever asked what life looked like before the ribbon cuttings, before the smiling photographs, and long before anyone believed I had accomplished something worth celebrating. My grandfather knew because he had witnessed every difficult season without needing an explanation. Long before my bakery became a familiar part of our town, it existed only as a handwritten business plan folded inside the pocket of my winter coat. I was 34 years old, raising my son Michael while working 2 different jobs, and every dollar seemed to disappear before the next paycheck arrived. During the day, I managed the front counter of a neighborhood grocery store. At night, I baked pies and cinnamon rolls in the kitchen of a small diner whose owner believed homemade desserts brought people back more often than advertisements ever could. I slept 4 or 5 hours on most nights, convinced that exhaustion was temporary, but giving up might last forever. My grandfather never told me to slow down. Instead, every Saturday morning he invited me to his workshop for coffee before work. He would sand the edge of a table or polish a rocking chair while I balanced my monthly expenses on a yellow legal pad. Sometimes neither of us spoke for 20 minutes. Those quiet mornings taught me more than any business seminar ever could. He believed people thought more clearly when nobody rushed them to fill the silence. One cold February morning, I stared at my notebook and quietly admitted that I was thinking about abandoning my dream. The numbers simply refused to cooperate. Rent kept increasing. Flour cost more than it had the year before. My old delivery van needed repairs I could not afford. I looked at him and said maybe dreams belong to people with better timing. He set down his sanding block, wiped the sawdust from his hands, and asked me only one question. He wanted to know whether I still loved baking as much as I had when I first learned from my grandmother. I answered yes without hesitation. He nodded once and returned to his work as though the conversation had already been settled. Looking back, I realized he never encouraged unrealistic optimism. He simply refused to let temporary hardship rewrite permanent purpose. A few months later, I finally rented a tiny storefront that had once been an old flower shop. The building measured barely 900 square feet. The ceiling leaked whenever heavy rain lasted more than an hour. The display windows rattled during winter windstorms, and the ancient oven seemed determined to stop working every holiday weekend. Friends politely questioned whether opening a bakery in such a small location made financial sense. My grandfather visited before opening day carrying nothing more than an old wooden rolling pin that had belonged to my grandmother. He placed it on the counter and quietly told me that every worthwhile business deserved one tool that reminded its owner why the work mattered. I still keep that rolling pin in my office today. During the first year, there were mornings when only 3 customers walked through the front door before noon. Some afternoons I stood behind the register wondering how many more weeks I could survive before closing permanently. There were evenings when I carried unsold bread to the local shelter because throwing it away felt worse than losing the money. Every time discouragement threatened to settle in, my grandfather appeared with another excuse to stop by. Sometimes he claimed he needed coffee. Sometimes he insisted a cabinet hinge needed tightening. Other times, he simply sat near the window reading the newspaper while quietly observing the rhythm of the bakery. He never interfered with my decisions. He simply reminded me through his presence that difficult seasons eventually passed if the foundation remained strong. As the years moved forward, the bakery slowly became part of the community. Customers returned with their children, then later with grandchildren. High school students who worked their first part-time jobs behind my counter eventually returned years later wearing business suits to introduce me to their own families. The success people celebrated did not arrive overnight. It arrived one ordinary morning at a time, hidden inside thousands of small decisions that nobody applauded while they were happening. Even after the bakery became profitable, I continued living modestly because every extra dollar returned to the business. I postponed vacations. I drove the same dependable sedan long after friends suggested replacing it. Whenever people complimented what I had built, I thanked them sincerely, but inside I remembered every unpaid invoice that had once kept me awake until dawn. Those memories never made me bitter. They made me grateful. Standing in my bakery the morning after the community ceremony, I watched the first customers step through the front door, carrying the same familiar smiles they had worn for years. They congratulated me on the award, admired the plaque, and joked that I had finally become famous. I laughed with them because they deserved to celebrate the moment. Still, while pouring fresh coffee into thick ceramic mugs and arranging warm blueberry muffins inside the display case, I found myself thinking about something entirely different. If everything I had sacrificed had only produced a successful business, then perhaps my grandfather would have been right to question whether the journey had truly been worth it. The truth was that the bakery had never been the greatest thing my years of hard work created, and before long, I would discover that someone much closer to me had begun measuring its value in a completely different way. The morning after the award ceremony began like every other weekday, long before the sun reached the rooftops along Main Street. I unlocked the front door of the bakery at 5:30, switched on the warm lights above the display cases, and listened to the familiar quiet that always existed before the first customers arrived. That peaceful half hour had become my favorite part of every day because nothing expected anything from me yet. There were no conversations to navigate, no decisions waiting for answers, only the comforting rhythm of measuring flour, warming ovens, and preparing dough the same careful way I had done for more than 30 years. My grandfather often said that people revealed their true character in ordinary moments because there was no audience to impress. As I arranged fresh blueberry muffins beside cinnamon rolls still releasing thin streams of steam into the cool morning air, I thought about his words more than usual. The award resting inside its glass case near the entrance caught the light every time I walked past it. Customers would notice it within seconds of entering. They would congratulate me again, smile warmly, and tell me how proud the town was of everything I had accomplished. I appreciated every kind word because they came from genuine hearts. Even so, I could not shake the feeling that everyone was celebrating the wrong thing. Around 7 o'clock, my son Michael arrived, carrying 2 large cups of coffee from the cafe across the street, even though he knew I preferred the coffee brewed in my own kitchen. He laughed when I teased him about wasting money and handed me one of the cups anyway. At 43 years old, he had grown into a hard-working man who cared deeply about his family, and seeing him walk through the bakery each morning reminded me why I had fought so hard to keep the business alive during those difficult early years. A few minutes later, his wife Rachel joined us after dropping their children at school. She complimented the award display and insisted that I move it closer to the front window where everyone could see it more easily. I smiled politely and told her it looked perfectly fine where it was. She laughed and said I had always been too modest for my own good. The conversation drifted naturally toward holiday orders, staffing schedules, and the growing number of catering requests we had received after the ceremony. On the surface, everything felt completely normal. Yet as I watched Rachel studying the bakery with unusual attention, I noticed something I had somehow overlooked before. She was not admiring the shelves filled with fresh bread or the customers lining up at the register. Her eyes lingered on the office door at the back of the building where business records, financial files, and ownership documents were stored. The glance lasted only a second before she turned back toward us with her usual friendly smile. But once I noticed it, I could not forget it. Throughout the morning, several longtime customers stopped to congratulate me again. Mrs. Henderson brought homemade apple butter as a gift. Coach Reynolds joked that I finally deserved a day off after feeding half the town for 3 decades. Young parents pointed toward the award while telling their children that hard work eventually paid off. I thanked everyone sincerely, but my grandfather's question continued echoing quietly in my thoughts. Was this really the reward everyone believed I had spent my life chasing? Around noon, my grandfather walked through the front door, wearing his old brown wool coat despite the unusually mild weather. He never called before visiting. He believed family should not need appointments. Every employee greeted him by name because they all loved listening to his stories while waiting for fresh bread to come out of the ovens. He accepted a cup of black coffee, chose his usual chair beside the front window, and spent nearly an hour simply watching the bakery operate. He rarely commented on sales or profits. Instead, he noticed things other people ignored. He smiled when one of the younger employees carried an elderly customer's groceries to her car without being asked. He quietly nodded when another worker stayed late to help clean the kitchen even though her shift had already ended. Before leaving, he walked slowly beside me through the empty dining area. He rested one hand on the back of a wooden chair and said something that sounded almost casual. Success always attracts people who admire what you built. It also attracts people who start wondering how much of it might someday belong to them. I looked at him, surprised by the unusual seriousness in his voice. He did not explain further. Instead, he patted my shoulder, wished me a good afternoon, and stepped outside into the crisp autumn sunlight. I stood near the front window watching him cross the street with steady determination despite his age. Something inside me shifted. My grandfather never spoke carelessly. If he chose those particular words, there was a reason. Later that evening, after the last customer left and the bakery finally grew quiet again, I locked the front door and carried the day's receipts into my office. As I organized invoices inside the filing cabinet, I noticed one folder sitting slightly farther forward than I remembered leaving it that morning. It was a tiny difference, no more than half an inch, but I had always been meticulous about keeping my records in order. I stared at the cabinet for several silent seconds before gently closing the drawer without opening the folder. Perhaps I had simply forgotten. Perhaps I had not. For reasons I could not yet explain, I suddenly remembered the expression on my grandfather's face when he warned me that success attracted more than admiration. And for the first time since receiving that beautiful community award, I found myself wondering whether the greatest challenge of my life had only just begun. That night, I stayed at the bakery long after every light along Main Street had gone dark. The ovens had cooled. The chairs were stacked neatly on top of the tables. Even the familiar hum of the refrigerators seemed quieter than usual. I sat alone in my office staring at the filing cabinet without opening it, trying to decide whether I was allowing one small detail to grow into unnecessary suspicion. Half an inch. That was all the difference had been. A folder sitting slightly farther forward than I remembered. It sounded almost foolish when I said it aloud. After 30 years of working 6 days a week, perhaps I had simply become tired enough to question my own memory. Then I remembered something my grandfather had repeated throughout my childhood. He always said that careful people did not notice everything because they were suspicious. They noticed everything because paying attention was a habit. I trusted his judgment far more than I trusted my doubts. Instead of opening the drawer immediately, I made myself another cup of coffee and slowly walked through the bakery one last time before going home. Fresh bread still filled the air with its comforting aroma, reminding me how many ordinary mornings had quietly become extraordinary years. Every table carried memories. A young couple had celebrated their engagement in the corner booth beside the window. A retired teacher held a weekly breakfast with former students every Thursday morning. Children measured their height against the old brick wall every birthday because their parents started the tradition years earlier. Looking around, I realized the bakery had become more than a business. It had become part of the town's story. That thought made my grandfather's warning feel even heavier. Success was never only about money when so many lives became connected to what you built. I finally returned to my office and unlocked the filing cabinet. Every folder appeared perfectly organized. Payroll, vendor contracts, tax records, property insurance, employee benefits. Nothing seemed missing. Still, when I reached for the folder that had caught my attention earlier, I noticed the paper clip securing several documents had been placed on the opposite corner from where I always kept it. Most people would never have noticed. I had used the same filing system for decades. My hands followed those routines almost without thinking. Someone had opened the folder, reviewed its contents, and closed it again carefully enough that only tiny details remained out of place. I slowly read through every page. Nothing had been removed. Nothing appeared damaged. Whoever looked inside had been searching for information rather than trying to steal paperwork. I quietly closed the folder and locked the cabinet again. The discovery unsettled me far less than my own reaction. I did not feel angry. I felt curious. Curiosity often uncovered truths that frustration never could. The following afternoon, my grandfather invited me to lunch at the farmhouse. He had prepared his favorite vegetable soup using my grandmother's handwritten recipe, insisting that soup always tasted better after the first frost of the season. We ate in comfortable silence while afternoon sunlight warmed the old pine kitchen table that had belonged to our family longer than I had been alive. After clearing our bowls, he poured fresh coffee and looked at me with the calm expression that always told me he had already noticed something before I spoke. I finally mentioned the filing cabinet. I described the folder, the paper clip, and the strange feeling that someone had quietly searched through business records without saying a word. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he folded his hands together and looked toward the window overlooking the fields. Instead of asking who I suspected, he asked something entirely different. He wanted to know whether anyone had recently become unusually interested in the bakery's future rather than its present. I thought carefully before answering. Rachel had mentioned expanding to additional locations several times over the past year. She often suggested hiring outside consultants, restructuring ownership, or creating a long-term succession plan much sooner than I believed necessary. At the time, I assumed she simply wanted the business to continue thriving for the next generation. My grandfather nodded thoughtfully. There was nothing wrong with planning ahead, he said quietly. The important question was whether people were protecting what already existed or quietly preparing to control it. His words lingered in my mind long after lunch ended. During the following week, I paid closer attention without changing my routine. Rachel remained warm, helpful, and unfailingly polite. She greeted every customer by name whenever possible and treated employees with genuine respect. Yet I noticed she asked increasingly specific questions about business accounts, insurance policies, property deeds, and long-term ownership decisions. She always presented those questions as practical conversations, never demanding or confrontational. Michael usually listened with interest before returning to daily operations, trusting that everything would eventually work itself out. Watching the two of them together, I became convinced of one thing. My son genuinely wanted what was best for the family. Whether he understood every conversation happening around him was another matter entirely. Late Friday afternoon, after closing the bakery, I found an old photograph tucked inside the top drawer of my office desk. It showed my grandfather standing beside me on opening day more than 30 years earlier. We were both covered in flour, laughing because the first batch of dinner rolls had come out uneven, yet every customer bought them anyway. Written across the back in my grandfather's careful handwriting were only 7 words. Build character first. Everything else can follow. I smiled as I slipped the photograph back into the drawer. At that moment, I finally understood why he never rushed to give advice. He had spent a lifetime teaching me to recognize the difference between protecting a business and protecting the values that made the business worth building in the first place. Somewhere beyond those quiet lessons, I sensed another truth waiting patiently to reveal itself, and for reasons I could not yet explain, I knew my grandfather had been expecting this season of my life long before I ever saw it coming. Over the next several days, I made one quiet decision that surprised even me. I stopped trying to answer questions before anyone asked them. For most of my life, I believed good communication solved almost every problem. If someone misunderstood my intentions, I explained them. If an employee worried about the future, I reassured them. If a family member wondered why I made a particular business decision, I patiently walked through every reason until everyone felt comfortable. That habit had helped me build lasting relationships with customers and employees, but I slowly realized it also made me predictable. People who expected explanations eventually stopped looking for the truth themselves because they assumed I would always provide it. My grandfather noticed the change almost immediately. When he visited the bakery the following Tuesday, he watched me greet customers, review inventory, and helped decorate birthday cakes without once mentioning the conversation we had shared at his farmhouse. As he prepared to leave, he quietly smiled and said only one word. Good. I understood exactly what he meant. Sometimes silence was not avoidance. Sometimes it was patience. Life inside the bakery continued with its familiar rhythm. Morning deliveries arrived before sunrise. School teachers stopped in for coffee on their way to work. Construction crews filled the front tables before heading to job sites across town. Children pressed their hands against the display case while trying to choose between chocolate chip cookies and glazed donuts. From the outside, nothing had changed. Behind the scenes, I simply became more attentive than ever before. Instead of reacting to every unusual detail, I allowed those details to gather naturally. Rachel continued bringing thoughtful suggestions to nearly every staff meeting. She recommended modern accounting software, discussed long-term expansion plans, and gently encouraged me to consider reducing my workload now that I had received public recognition from the community. Her ideas sounded practical. Many of them were genuinely useful, yet I noticed they all quietly moved toward the same destination. Every conversation eventually returned to ownership, succession, or transferring responsibility. Michael usually agreed that planning ahead made sense, although he rarely appeared interested in discussing legal details. His attention remained focused on customers, recipes, and daily operations. Watching him interact with employees reminded me of the little boy who once swept bakery floors after school just to earn enough money for his first baseball glove. His heart had not changed. That realization made everything even more complicated because I could no longer believe this situation was simply about right and wrong. It felt as though different people were quietly measuring success by completely different standards. One rainy Thursday afternoon, Rachel offered to stay late and help organize several years of archived business records stored in the office closet. She explained that scanning older documents into digital files would protect them from accidental damage and make future audits much easier. It was a thoughtful suggestion, and under different circumstances I probably would have accepted without hesitation. Instead, I thanked her sincerely and explained that I planned to review those records personally over the winter. She smiled warmly and said she completely understood. As she turned toward the kitchen, I noticed another expression appear for only an instant before disappearing beneath her usual confidence. It was not anger. It was disappointment. That brief moment stayed with me long after she left for the evening. The following Saturday, I visited my grandfather again. He was repairing an old cedar chest that had belonged to my great-grandparents, carefully replacing worn hinges rather than buying new ones. He always believed preserving something worthwhile required more patience than replacing it. While handing him a screwdriver, I told him about Rachel's offer to organize the archives. He listened without interrupting, tightening one final screw before setting his tools aside. Then he asked whether I trusted her intentions or simply appreciated her efficiency. The question caught me completely off guard because I realized those were not the same thing. I admitted that I honestly did not know anymore. He nodded slowly as though that answer was enough. He reminded me that capable people often earn trust quickly because they solve problems well, but lasting trust came from watching how someone behaved when they believed nobody was paying attention. Before leaving, he disappeared into the upstairs bedroom and returned carrying a worn leather notebook. The edges had softened with age, and several pages were marked with small pieces of folded paper. He handed it to me without explanation. Inside the front cover, written in his careful handwriting, were the words, "Every generation receives more than money. Some receive responsibility. Some receive opportunity. The wisest receive both." I looked up, expecting him to explain why he had given it to me now instead of years earlier. He simply smiled and told me that certain lessons only made sense after life asked the right questions. Driving home that evening, the notebook rested on the passenger seat beside me. The setting sun painted the fields with deep shades of gold, and for the first time in weeks, I felt remarkably calm. I was no longer searching for proof that something was wrong. I was quietly learning what my grandfather had understood all along. Character revealed itself gradually, not during dramatic confrontations, but through ordinary choices repeated over time. As I pulled into the bakery parking lot to prepare for another busy week, I noticed Michael and Rachel standing together near the back entrance, speaking quietly beside the delivery truck. They stopped the moment my car turned the corner, smiled naturally, and waved as though nothing unusual had happened. I waved back with the same warm smile I had always worn. Yet somewhere deep inside, I realized the season of simply observing was bringing me closer to an answer that would change far more than the future of my bakery. A week later, my grandfather telephoned just before sunrise and asked whether I could meet him at the old woodworking shop instead of the farmhouse. His voice sounded calm as always, yet there was a quiet seriousness behind every word that immediately caught my attention. I arrived shortly after opening the bakery, leaving Michael in charge of the morning rush because he insisted everything would be fine for a couple of hours. The workshop looked almost exactly as it had when I was 10 years old. The scent of cedar still lingered in the air. Rows of carefully organized hand tools hung neatly along the walls. Sunlight slipped through the dusty windows and settled across the worn wooden workbench, where my grandfather had spent most of his life creating furniture that families would pass from one generation to the next. He was already waiting beside the bench with 2 steaming mugs of coffee and a small wooden box resting between them. Without saying anything, he handed me one of the mugs and motioned toward the chair across from him. We sat together for several quiet minutes before he finally opened the box. Inside rested dozens of handwritten index cards held together with a faded blue ribbon. Every card contained the name of a customer, the year he built something for them, and 1 or 2 sentences describing why the piece mattered. One card mentioned a dining table built for a young couple celebrating their first home. Another described a rocking chair made for a widow who wanted somewhere peaceful to read every evening. Another recorded a small bookshelf built for a little boy recovering from a long illness because books had become his favorite escape. I looked up in surprise and asked why he had kept records like these for so many years. He smiled gently and answered that he had never been building furniture. He had been building memories that happened to be made from wood. His words stayed with me long after we finished reading through the cards. Before I left, he placed the box in my hands and quietly told me that every successful business eventually faces one important question. Does it exist to protect what it earns, or does it exist to protect what it creates? Driving back toward town, I could not stop thinking about that distinction. By the time I reached the bakery, the lunchtime crowd had already filled nearly every table. Michael greeted customers with his usual easy smile, while Rachel efficiently organized catering orders behind the front counter. Watching them work together reminded me how much effort they invested every single day. Nothing about either of them appeared dishonest. That was exactly what made everything so difficult. During the afternoon, Rachel asked whether we could review the annual financial reports before the end of the month, because she believed the business had reached a point where larger decisions deserved careful planning. I agreed without hesitation. There was nothing unreasonable about her request. In fact, years earlier I probably would have suggested the same meeting myself. Yet this time I paid closer attention to the details. She was less interested in the bakery's daily performance than in the long-term ownership structure. She wanted to discuss succession, voting authority, and future control if I eventually decided to retire. Michael listened quietly, occasionally adding practical comments about staffing or equipment upgrades. But whenever the discussion turned toward legal authority, he simply looked at Rachel and trusted her judgment. That small pattern repeated itself often enough that I finally recognized it. My son depended upon her confidence in areas he had never taken time to study himself. That realization did not make me angry. It made me protective. Later that evening, after everyone else had gone home, I unlocked the office cabinet once again and removed several old binders that had not been opened in years. They contained photographs from the bakery's earliest days, newspaper clippings, employee appreciation letters, and dozens of handwritten thank you notes from customers whose lives had crossed mine in unexpected ways. Buried beneath those keepsakes rested a sealed envelope addressed in my grandfather's handwriting. I had completely forgotten it existed. The envelope had been given to me years earlier with simple instructions to open it only when I began wondering what my real legacy would be. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the letter inside. It was surprisingly short. My grandfather wrote that people often spent their lives protecting buildings, bank accounts, and business records while forgetting to protect the principles that created them. He reminded me that ownership without character eventually became empty, but character could rebuild almost anything that was honestly lost. Near the bottom of the page, he added one final sentence that immediately brought tears to my eyes. Someday someone will ask for what you built. Before answering, make certain they also understand why you built it. I carefully folded the letter and returned it to the envelope. Suddenly, every conversation from the previous few weeks felt different. Rachel had been asking how the bakery should be transferred. My grandfather had been asking whether its purpose would survive the transfer itself. Those were completely different questions. Standing alone inside the quiet office, I looked through the window toward the empty dining room where thousands of conversations had unfolded over the years between neighbors, families, veterans, students, teachers, and strangers who eventually became regular customers. The bakery had never simply sold bread. It had quietly given people a place where ordinary lives connected every single day. That was the inheritance my grandfather wanted me to protect. As I switched off the office light and prepared to lock the building for the night, I realized the answers I had been searching for were no longer hidden inside financial records or legal documents. They had been sitting in plain sight all along, waiting for me to recognize that the greatest legacy any business could leave behind was the character of the people trusted to carry it into the future. The days leading up to Thanksgiving carried the familiar excitement that always filled our bakery. Orders covered nearly every page of the appointment book. Families reserved pies weeks in advance, and the kitchen buzzed with steady conversation from before dawn until long after sunset. Every employee worked harder than usual, yet nobody complained because serving the community during the holidays had always been one of the greatest joys of the business. Watching everyone move together with quiet purpose reminded me why I had never measured success by the balance in a bank account. Success looked like people who trusted one another enough to work side by side through the busiest season of the year. One afternoon, I asked Michael to help unload several deliveries while Rachel remained inside organizing customer invoices. As I carried flour into the storage room, I overheard part of a conversation drifting through the slightly open office door. Rachel's voice remained calm and confident as she explained that waiting too long to reorganize ownership could create unnecessary complications someday. She spoke carefully, choosing every word with the precision of someone who had rehearsed the conversation many times before. Michael answered quietly that he trusted my judgment and believed I would make whatever decision was best for everyone. There was no argument between them, no anger, only two people looking at the future from different directions. I stepped away before either of them realized I had returned because hearing only part of a conversation often revealed less than people imagined. My grandfather had taught me never to build conclusions from unfinished sentences. Instead, I simply continued observing. A few days later, Rachel surprised the staff by announcing she had arranged a meeting with a respected business consultant who specialized in helping family companies transition from one generation to the next. She enthusiastically explained that the consultation would be completely free and could help us avoid expensive mistakes in the future. Every employee smiled politely, assuming it sounded like a responsible idea. Michael thanked her for taking the initiative. Then everyone turned toward me, waiting for my opinion. I smiled warmly and told Rachel I appreciated the effort she had invested in arranging the meeting. I also explained that before involving outside advisors, I wanted to finish reviewing several family matters that had been on my mind for quite some time. She accepted my answer graciously, although I noticed that same fleeting look of disappointment crossing her face before her pleasant smile returned. The expression lasted less than a second, yet by now I had seen it enough times to recognize it immediately. That evening I drove to my grandfather's farmhouse, carrying a fresh loaf of cranberry walnut bread that I knew he enjoyed every November. He welcomed me inside with his usual quiet smile and asked about the bakery before I mentioned anything else. After listening patiently to everything that had happened during the week, he walked toward the fireplace and carefully placed another log onto the glowing embers. Without turning around, he asked whether I remembered learning to sand my first wooden chair in his workshop. I laughed because I remembered becoming frustrated after only a few minutes. I wanted the rough surface to become smooth immediately. He reminded me that I had kept insisting I was finished long before the work was actually complete. Then he looked directly at me and said that people often became impatient when they wanted results before character had enough time to reveal itself. Those words settled quietly into my heart. On the drive home, I realized I no longer felt anxious about discovering hidden motives. Instead, I felt grateful that my grandfather continued teaching me lessons at 91 years old exactly as he had when I was a child. The following Monday brought one small event that changed everything. A longtime customer named Mrs. Whitaker stopped by after lunch carrying an old photo album she wanted me to see. Inside were pictures from dozens of community events stretching back nearly 25 years. School fundraisers, church breakfasts, charity bake sales, veterans appreciation dinners. Nearly every page contained someone from our bakery volunteering, donating food, or quietly helping neighbors without expecting recognition. Looking through those photographs, I realized the bakery had become woven into the history of our town in ways I had almost forgotten. Mrs. Whitaker smiled as she turned the final page and gently told me that businesses came and went every year, but places that cared for people became part of their families forever. After she left, I remained alone in the dining room holding the album across my lap. At that moment, I understood something my grandfather had been trying to teach me from the very beginning. The true value of the bakery could never be measured by annual profits, property values, or expansion plans because those things only described what we owned. They did not describe what we meant to other people. Later that afternoon, Rachel entered the dining room carrying a stack of invoices. She noticed the old photographs and smiled as she sat beside me. Together we looked through several pages in comfortable silence. She pointed toward a picture taken during the bakery's 10th anniversary celebration and quietly admitted she wished she had been part of those early years because everyone looked so happy. I looked at her carefully before answering that every generation eventually received an opportunity to protect something meaningful. The important choice was deciding whether to preserve its purpose or simply inherit its success. She nodded thoughtfully without saying another word. Watching her close the album and place it gently back into my hands, I realized the moment I had been waiting for was drawing closer. Sooner rather than later, everyone in my family would have to decide what they truly believed my years of hard work had been worth, and when that day finally arrived, no speech or business record would reveal the answer as clearly as the choices each of us would make. The first Monday of December arrived with a light snowfall that covered Main Street in a quiet blanket of white, making every storefront look as though it belonged on an old holiday postcard. The bakery opened before dawn as always, filling the cold morning air with the warm scent of cinnamon, butter, and fresh bread that drifted onto the sidewalk each time the front door opened. Customers smiled as they stamped snow from their boots, wrapped chilled hands around steaming cups of coffee, and settled into familiar tables where conversations had begun for decades. Watching them reminded me once again that my grandfather had been right. We had never simply sold baked goods. We had become part of people's ordinary lives. That realization made the decisions waiting ahead feel even more important. Shortly before lunch, Rachel stopped by my office carrying a neatly organized folder. She explained that the consultant she had contacted had prepared several sample succession plans for family-owned businesses and thought we might find them helpful whenever we decided to review the bakery's future. Her voice remained warm and respectful, and I genuinely appreciated the effort she had invested. I accepted the folder, thanked her sincerely, and promised to read everything carefully before discussing it with anyone. She smiled with visible relief, almost as though she believed an important step had finally moved forward. After she returned to the front counter, I opened the folder alone. The documents were professionally prepared and entirely reasonable. They described ownership structures, retirement strategies, tax considerations, and management transitions. There was nothing improper about the information itself. Yet every recommendation quietly assumed the same outcome. Eventually, I would step aside, and someone else would control what I had spent a lifetime building. Closing the folder, I realized my grandfather had once again prepared me to ask a better question. Nobody had asked whether the next person understood what truly deserved protecting. That afternoon, I drove to the farmhouse without calling ahead. I found my grandfather sitting beside the fireplace reading an old history book while snowflakes drifted past the living room windows. He looked up, smiled, and somehow seemed unsurprised to see me standing there with the folder still tucked beneath my arm. I placed it on the coffee table between us without saying a word. He slowly adjusted his reading glasses, glanced toward the papers, and then looked back at me. Instead of asking what the consultant recommended, he quietly asked what I believed the bakery would lose if every recommendation inside became reality. The question caught me completely off guard because my first instinct had been to think about financial risks, ownership percentages, and legal responsibilities. None of those answers felt complete anymore. After several moments of silence, I finally admitted that my greatest fear was not losing control of the business. My greatest fear was watching the bakery slowly become just another profitable company instead of remaining a place where people genuinely felt welcomed. My grandfather smiled softly. He reached toward the bookshelf behind his chair and removed a weathered framed photograph of my grandmother standing behind the bakery's very first holiday cookie display more than 30 years earlier. Customers filled the room. Children laughed near the window, and my grandmother looked happier than I had remembered seeing her in years. He handed me the photograph and quietly reminded me that nobody in the picture had been thinking about future ownership that day. They had been thinking about serving their neighbors well. Every worthwhile legacy, he said, eventually reaches a moment when someone must choose between preserving purpose and increasing convenience. Those two paths often look almost identical at first, but over time they lead to very different destinations. Driving back to town with the photograph resting beside me, I finally understood why my grandfather had never criticized Rachel's ideas directly. Her plans were not necessarily wrong. They simply answered a different question than the one he believed mattered most. Over the next several days, I watched the bakery with fresh eyes. I noticed the high school student who stayed after work to help an elderly customer carry several pie boxes to her car without being asked. I noticed Michael, kneeling beside a little boy to replace a cookie that had accidentally fallen onto the floor, refusing to accept payment for another one because he wanted the child to leave smiling. I noticed Rachel patiently helping a young employee reorganize holiday schedules so everyone could spend time with their families. Those moments reminded me that goodness already existed inside our business. The challenge was not choosing between good people and bad people. The challenge was deciding which values deserved protecting before any legal documents were ever signed. Late Friday afternoon, just before closing, I found an envelope resting on my office desk with no name written across the front. Inside was a handwritten note from my grandfather containing only one sentence. The hardest inheritance to pass along is the one that cannot be listed inside a will. I folded the note carefully and placed it beside the photograph inside my desk drawer. Standing there in the quiet office while employees laughed together in the kitchen preparing for another busy holiday weekend, I realized the conversation I needed to have with my family was approaching much sooner than anyone expected. Yet before a single decision could be made about buildings, ownership, or business plans, I intended to ask one simple question that would reveal far more than any financial statement ever could, because by then I finally understood exactly what my grandfather had been trying to teach me all along. The Saturday before Christmas arrived bright and cold, and by 8 o'clock every table inside the bakery was filled with families sharing breakfast before beginning their holiday shopping. Laughter blended with the familiar sounds of coffee cups, quiet conversations, and the steady rhythm of our kitchen preparing one final wave of fresh pastries. Looking around the dining room, I realized I had spent more than 30 years watching strangers become neighbors and neighbors become lifelong friends inside these walls. Every holiday season reminded me that the bakery belonged to far more people than the family whose name appeared above the front door. That afternoon, after the last catering order had been loaded into waiting cars, I invited Michael, Rachel, and my grandfather into the office. The atmosphere remained relaxed because everyone assumed we would simply discuss the coming year. I placed the old photograph of my grandmother beside the leather notebook my grandfather had given me, along with the handwritten note that had rested in my desk for so many years. No contracts lay on the table. No legal documents waited to be signed. My grandfather quietly settled into the chair beside the window, saying nothing as always. I looked first at Michael and then at Rachel before asking the only question that truly mattered. I wanted to know what they believed the bakery represented. Michael answered first without hesitation. He smiled as he looked through the office window toward the dining room and said the bakery had given him a childhood filled with honest work, dependable friendships, and lessons he hoped to pass along to his own children someday. He admitted that whenever people recognized him around town, they rarely mentioned bread or pastries. They thanked him because the bakery had sponsored school events, donated meals after difficult storms, and quietly helped families whenever someone experienced hardship. Listening to him, I recognized the little boy who had swept flour from the floor after school simply because he wanted to help. Then Rachel spoke. She took a slow breath before answering. She admitted that when she first joined our family, she mostly saw the bakery as a successful business that deserved modern planning and stronger financial structure. She explained that as the years passed, she became increasingly focused on protecting its future because she believed growth and careful organization would honor everything I had accomplished. Then her voice softened. She looked around the office, toward the old rolling pin that had belonged to my grandmother, the faded photographs on the wall, and the handwritten employee thank you cards framed beside my desk. Quietly, she admitted that somewhere along the way she had become so focused on preserving the business that she had almost forgotten to protect the reason people loved it in the first place. No one interrupted her. The room remained completely silent except for the distant sound of customers laughing in the dining room. My grandfather finally reached toward the photograph resting on the table and gently slid it closer to Rachel. He asked her what she saw. She smiled sadly and answered that she saw people who genuinely enjoyed serving others. He nodded with quiet satisfaction and said that businesses survive because of accounting, planning, and good decisions, but legacies survive because ordinary people chose kindness every single day, even when nobody was watching. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked toward me with the same calm expression he had worn outside the courthouse weeks earlier. In that moment, I finally understood why he had never warned me against trusting my family. He had simply wanted each of us to discover our own priorities before important decisions were made. I opened the leather notebook to its first page and slowly read the words he had written years earlier. Every generation receives more than money. Some receive responsibility. Some receive opportunity. The wisest receive both. Closing the notebook again, I smiled and told my family that the bakery would remain exactly where it belonged. It would continue serving the community, guided by the same values that built it from the beginning. Future leadership would never depend only on ownership papers or financial knowledge. It would always depend upon protecting the purpose that gave the business meaning. Michael nodded immediately. Rachel quietly reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. She apologized for allowing practical concerns to become more important than the deeper legacy she had gradually come to understand. There were no dramatic speeches and no harsh accusations because none were necessary. The lesson had already been learned. Later that evening, after everyone returned home, I drove my grandfather back to the farmhouse beneath a sky filled with bright winter stars. Before getting out of the car, he rested one weathered hand gently over mine and smiled with unmistakable pride. Neither of us mentioned the award, the consultant, or the conversations that had occupied so much of the past several weeks. Instead, he quietly asked whether I finally understood the answer I had given him outside the courthouse. I looked toward the familiar porch light glowing against the fresh snow and smiled. More than ever before, I did. Every long morning, every sleepless night, every sacrifice, every difficult decision, every loaf of bread baked before sunrise, every employee encouraged, every neighbor helped, every child welcomed, and every lesson patiently passed from one generation to the next had created something no trophy could ever measure. That was why my years of hard work had been worth far more than anyone could see. The greatest reward had never been the bakery itself. It had been building a life that taught the people I loved how to protect something meaningful long after I was gone. And as I watched my grandfather walk slowly toward the farmhouse with quiet confidence, I realized that was the inheritance he had been giving me all along.